One of the longest-running debates in the social sciences has concerned the causes and geography of the transition from feudalism to capitalism in medieval and early modern Europe.
The debate on transition from feudalism to capitalism had come to develop a kind of orthodox mold, even though there couldn't be said to have been a single uniform orthodoxy. So on the one hand, Maurice Dobb had made the argument that feudalism collapsed because of its own internal contradictions, which is known as internal contradictions hypothesis. On the other hand, Paul Sweezy had made the argument that feudalism collapsed because the economy of no outlets had been forced to open as a result of commercialization of European economy in the 14th and 15th centuries. Subsequently, M.M. Poston made his intervention by arguing that the real tilting factor in all of this had been the demographic situation, or the changing demographic situation across the centuries, and the result was the gradual dismantling of the feudal order, which came from a different demographic regime to one which favored the laboring classes more than it did the feudal classes. The real challenge to the internal contradictions and commercialization hypothesis had, however, come in the 1970s from Robert Brenner.
In the mid-1970s, stimulated by an American historian, Robert Brenner, the transition debate entered a new phase. Brenner rewalked an older argument that the structure of class power and class relations, rather than demographic or commercial change, determined long-run patterns of European economic development.
None of these theses, Brenner argued, give a very convincing explanation as to why similarity of phenomenon nevertheless resulted in differential outcomes in Western and Eastern Europe.
Brenner wrote in his essay Agrarian Class Structure and Economic Development in Pre-Industrial Europe, published in issue number 70 of Past and Present. Class structure has two analytically distinct but historically unified aspects. First, the relationship of the direct producers to one another, to their tools and to their land in the immediate process of production, what is being called the labor process or the social forces of production. Second, the inherently conflictive relations of property, always guaranteed directly or indirectly by force, by which an unpaid-for product is extracted from the direct producers by a class of non-producers, which might be called property relationship or surplus extraction relationship. It is around this relationship that one defines the fundamental classes in society. Class relations varied across Europe, causing demographic decline to have differing effects. Central to Brenner's argument are two geographical comparisons of social relations. The first comparison is between Western Europe, where lords lost their political control of feudal tenants, and Eastern Europe, where manorial lords strengthened their control over land and dependent peasantries. The second comparison is between France, where absolute peasant property rights became entrenched, and England, where peasants failed to establish absolute property rights, but achieved more flexible tenures.
Putting it simply, if commercialization had become such an important feature of European economic life in the 14th and 15th century, then why did the same commercialization result in the dismantling of the feudal hierarchy in Western Europe, even as it reinforced the same in Eastern Europe? Similarly, for Poston's argument, Brenner questioned that if population movements, first upward and then downward, in both Eastern and Western Europe took place on a similar scale, then why was it that it led to differential outcomes? Brenner's argument was that all these explanations were even though they were pretty sound in the substance of what they were arguing, had missed the basic plot of feudalism. An orthodox, very convinced Marxist, Brenner made the argument that all of these theses had ignored the fundamental point about Marxian understanding of economic relations and Marxian understanding of politics. It's that social changes take place, social revolutions take place, transformations take place, primarily through the agency of class structure.
Brenner continued in his article, "It would be my argument that different class structures, specifically property relations or surplus extraction relations, once established, tend to impose rather strict limits and possibilities, indeed, rather specific long-term patterns on a society's long-term development. At the same time, I would contend class structures tend to be highly resilient in relation to the impact of economic forces. As a rule, they are not shaped by or alterable in terms of demographic or commercial trends."
Brenner, unlike Poston or Sweezy, was arguing that the economic condition or the economic character of a particular social regime depends much more on political infrastructure or the political base that had been accounted for by either Sweezy and Poston.
Serfdom, Brenner wrote, denoted not merely, not even primarily, labor dues as opposed to money dues, but fundamentally powerful landlord rights to arbitrary extraction and a greater or lesser degree of peasant unfreedom. Thus, serfdom involved the landlord's ability to control his tenant's person, in particular his movements, so as to be able to determine the level of his rent in excess of custom, or what may be determined by the simple play of forces of supply and demand. For this reason, the decline of serfdom could not be achieved, as is sometimes implied, through simple commutation, equal exchange of money rent for labor rent, which might be transacted in the interest of greater efficiency for both parties. What would remain after commutation was still the lord's power over peasant. It is notable that commutation could be unilaterally dictated or reversed at the lord's will.
Brenner seems to argue that ultimately it was the differential political characters of Western and Eastern Europe that resulted in a differential outcome in terms of its economic dispensation. Brenner argued that if one was to take heed of the commercialization hypothesis, that commerce, or growing winds of commerce as it were, blew away the vestiges of feudalism, he said that argument was deeply flawed.
Brenner rejected the notion that European medieval society underwent an ecological crisis from 1300 AD, produced by an underlying ecological dynamic. He reasserted the Marxian position that agrarian crises were socially precipitated.
To start with, Sweezy had argued that towns had emerged as a result of the increasing dynamism of European commerce. As people had to move from place A to place B, they had to pass over a long stretch, and on the various points where they would keep on resting overnight, these would first emerge as small townships, and then these would in their own turn become centers of manufacture, and then they would begin to grow as colonies of people coming in, settling down and seeking their economic livelihood. And Sweezy had argued that this emergence of towns, this new urbanization that takes place in Europe, gave a space within which fugitives from the serf-based feudal order could seek refuge. Brenner's question was that why was it that the towns began to dot the West European landscape but left the East European landscape untouched? Sweezy had argued that in Eastern Europe, the landlords would not allow merchants to move in freely within their estates, and this restriction on the movement of the merchants in itself was the fundamental reason why towns did not emerge in Eastern Europe. Brenner's argument was that this did not wash. It is true that merchants were denied freedom of movement. Nevertheless, the reason had to be sought elsewhere. It was the differential character of state power in Western and Eastern Europe that ultimately proved to be the clinching argument. Brenner argued that in Western Europe, even before the onset of feudalism, vestiges of the Roman and Carolingian political traditions had created a very intricate network of rights and obligations for the rulers and the ruled alike. As a result, in Western Europe, even when feudalism was beginning to emerge as an alternative to the central authority, the basic idea of rule of law, where the rights and obligations of all powers were very carefully circumscribed, it never really died away. So, one of the defining features of feudalism in Western Europe, Brenner would argue, that the rights, the entitlements of the feudal lord vis-a-vis the tenants were very well defined. He could not increase taxes arbitrarily precisely because of this reason. And Brenner argued that because of the continuation of the Carolingian and the Roman traditions, ultimately in Western Europe, however weak the central authority might be, even at the height of feudalism, Crown nevertheless managed to retain a foothold because it was responsible for the implementation of those rights that had been inherited from centuries.
The legally dependent position of feudal tenants enabled lords to exact surplus above that produced by market forces. Ever greater surplus extraction from agricultural producers by feudal lords to finance competition for political status, the church, and the crown precipitated a crisis of reproduction in peasant agriculture and threatened peasant subsistence. On this reading, the late medieval crisis in feudal revenues was not merely connected to a more general crisis in the economy. It was the very eye of the storm.
So there were differential outcomes. Brenner has no doubt about it. That in France, for instance, there was a situation where the monarch was contesting the authority of the feudal aristocracy using the legal traditions. Although the French monarchy was considered to be the feudal superior, it was its ability to enforce feudal law that made it the feudal superior. In Britain, where the king was ultimately the largest lord in the land and all the other feudal lords found their position vis-a-vis the king to be one of a subordinate authority, it was guaranteed by the principle of divine right. As a result, the crown, either at its strongest, as in England in the 16th century, or in France, at its weakest, in the 12th or 13th century, always had an additional frame of existing laws that had to be maintained. And the struggle between the crown and the aristocracy, Brenner would argue, had always been buttressed by these existing set of rights. When commercialization began, Brenner would argue, one of the first major changes that takes place was that the king suddenly found an extra round of cash in his hand, with which he could maintain a much larger military force that he previously could. And with the deployment of gunpowder and fortresses that were capable of resisting gunpowder, the king easily becomes the central authority, although deriving his position from his privileges within the feudal hierarchy. Nevertheless, the king was able to enforce that same rule of law that he had been claiming to be a defender of in times of weakness. And given this particular willingness and ability, growing ability of the central authority as a result of commercialization to sort of tap the resources and develop political sinew, the king becomes more and more capable in defending the rights of the peasantry vis-a-vis the feudal lords. So the reason why the feudal lords could never actually be arbitrary in the Dobbsian sense of the term was because whenever the peasants were in a spot of jam, as it were, it was possible to resort to the crown to salvage them. And Brenner argues that this was primarily the reason why this ability of the king to extend security beyond the frame of the feudal structure was the reason why, when the feudal lords were assailing the towns looking for security, searching for security, began to approach the king. And as the king was able to provide this security, more and more towns could come up under the protective wings of the king himself. This was one part of the argument why towns were able to absorb a large number of fugitives from the feudal structure without allowing the feudal structure to actually bring the system down, that it was the centralized authority that was guaranteeing it. The second part of Brenner's argument about decline of feudalism in Western Europe pertained to the other question as to what was it that drove this thing on. Boston had argued in the 12th and 13th century, land reclamation was undertaken in order to feed the expanding population. And then Boston had argued in the 14th and 15th century, as there was a demographic downswing, population began to decline, there was a shift in terms of the character of the market. Earlier it was favoring the landlord, now it began to favor the serfs. Brenner argued that the market in the 14th and 15th century began to favor the serfs, not because of a demographic upswing being followed by a downswing, but for an entirely different reason. He argued that in Western Europe, the principal expansion of cultivation, the extension of cultivation that had taken place with the initiative of free peasantry. Peasants who had rights guaranteed by the state, rights that preceded the feudal lords. So what happened was that extension of cultivation took place outside the feudal estate, while the activities of the peasantry inside the feudal estate were very carefully circumscribed. Activities outside the feudal estate could not be so easily circumscribed. So a group of fugitives who goes out, expands cultivation, they do so outside the perimeters of the feudal estate. Now it was perfectly possible for the feudal lord to come in and demand a larger share of this extended cultivation. Brenner argues that the reason why they were not able to do so was that the king was perfectly happy to underwrite the resistance of the peasantry by saying that the feudal lords could not impose fresh dues for new areas being brought under cultivation. It was not altruism. The crowns were never supporting the peasantry simply because it was a good deed, their Saturday's good deed, as it were, week's good deed. What really prompted the crown forward was that if a social surplus is to be generated, then it has to be appropriated by the crown in order to strengthen the central authority, rather than allow it to strengthen feudal authority. So by underwriting the rights of the peasant, and are also underlining the obligations of the feudal lord to remain bound by feudal obligations and the restrictions imposed on his maneuverability, it was made certain that this expansion of cultivation resulted ultimately in the emergence of a free peasantry. And the feudal lords could also see that once they were unable to contain this growing population and their urge to expand cultivation, especially in the Western German lands and in the Netherlands, they were perfectly happy to switch to rent instead of a share in kind or a larger share in kind. As a result, Brenner argues that serfdom began to collapse with the commutation of rent, because it was the only way that the feudal lords could think of increasing their income. So it was not commercialization per se, nor the upswing and downswing of demographic movement, but rather the fact that the peasant was moving with well-defined rights that were being buttressed by the monarchical authority that made certain that feudalism collapsed in Western Europe. Brenner proves his argument by saying that we have to look at Eastern Europe for the very same time. When population was moving upwards and downwards, the problem of expansion of cultivation had affected Eastern Europe as well. And in Eastern Europe, the phenomenon that the Germans call Drang nach Osten, the drive towards the east, was led primarily by the Teutonic Knights, those who had feudal possessions in central Germany. They were clearing dense forests, lands inhabited by Poles, Wends and Magyars, and they were bringing to cultivation this region for the first time. Here, the writ of the central authority did not really run, because once settlements were inhabited, they would need to be protected, they would need to be secured against invasions from the east, from the Poles, Wends and Magyars, whom the Drang nach Osten was displacing. And Brenner argues that this protection was given not by the Holy Roman Emperor based in a remote capital in Vienna, but rather by the German Teutonic Knights who were in the forefront of this expansion. And Brenner argues that this new system that was beginning to emerge, best example being the Kingdom of Brandenburg, Prussia, was one where there were no previous rights of the peasantry that had to be buttressed. And the peasants were completely dependent upon the seigneurial lord for their physical security. If the exactions of the feudal lord at a time of growing commercialization would be excessive, these peasants had neither the right to run away nor a place to run away to. Hence, they had to accept almost in silence whatever pressure that the feudal lord was able to bear on them. So at a time when commutation of rent was taking place in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, not only did commutation of rent not take place, the growing demand of the feudal lord actually had to be addressed by an increase in the rental obligations, or rather in the revenue obligations of the German peasantry. Brenner argues that it was this decisive difference in the political character of Eastern Europe, where feudal authority had much greater political muscle without being checked by central authority, either as a king or as an emperor, that proved to be decisive. The peasants, having no rights to fall back on and no crown to defend such rights, was completely at the mercy of the feudal lord. And Brenner argues that it was this very dependence of the peasantry that allowed for the feudal lords to increase the obligation of an individual peasant from 2 days of hard labor in a week to 3 days, 4 days, and sometimes even 5 days. So that entire social surplus that was being generated in Eastern Europe would be benefiting the seigneurial lord much more. And Brenner argues that in a sense, this actually explains why towns did not grow in Eastern Europe as either. Because the merchants, as Sweezy had said, was not allowed into the estates. Because the feudal lord was able to establish a virtual monopoly of extraction of the social surplus, he did not need the mediation by merchants to disrupt the scheme. So the merchants would be based in entrepôts like Danzig or Gdansk, as it's now called in Poland, and the feudal lord would make available that entire social surplus which was generated for the West European grain market, and in return they would get all the luxury items that they were looking for. So while the East-West trade began to burgeon at a time of growing commercial horizons, the social situation in Western Europe was the decline of feudalism, the decline of feudal structure as the feudal economy began to mutate. On the Eastern Europe, because of a differential political system with fewer political rights belonging to the lower echelons of the society, the feudal lords managed to reinforce their strength, and as a consequence, they managed to reinvigorate feudalism at a time it was beginning to to collapse in Western Europe. Brenner therefore argues that it was the differential political dispensation of Western and Eastern Europe that results in the differential economic destinies of the two regions. In Western Europe, if internal contradiction or commercialization or demographic movements shaped Western European experience in terms of declining strength of feudalism, Brenner would argue it was primarily because of a juridical political framework that made it possible. In Eastern Europe, by contrast, this not being the case, the feudal lords were able to enhance the basket of their powers to a point where they could successfully eliminate central authority from the scheme of things, and there was to be, as to say, no class struggle in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, that same class struggle between the peasantry and the feudal lord, given the backing of the crown, managed to effect a change from one phase of production to another, from the feudal to the capitalist. In Eastern Europe, that outcome was not to come.
The editors of the journal Past and Present, in which Brenner's argument appeared, invited several responses and a rejoinder from Brenner.
While this argument of Brenner's, made in the 1970s, has been subsequently, people have attempted to modify this argument, in the main, this is now more or less the main orthodoxy that exists in the matter of transition, or to be more accurate, from the decline of feudalism.
Subsequent debates spilled over into historical, geographical, and social theory literatures. Recent attention to geographies of mineralization alongside work on medieval commercialization has produced several avenues of debate, not least in questioning the Poston thesis and in stimulating more geographically sensitive accounts of medieval England. English tenants' initiatives rebounded on them when demographic expansion resumed after 1500. Landlords now evicted peasant producers and installed entrepreneurial tenants, thereby producing agrarian capitalism.